Welcome back to another episode of Destin Talks to Random Cool People. This time, Rick Hogue is back. Rick, you said the last time we talked over Discord, it was like a year ago. It was last March. It is
It does
great
appear
to
to be
see you
last
again.
March. I'm just happy to be a random cool person, so I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, you sir. Well, you're a little less random than the regular guest because there's no rhyme or reason to it. I'm just like, hey, would you like to come on the show and talk? And you've actually been on with me talking about the FTC and Microsoft, and some stuff has been going on lately in that I'm going to talk to you about. But for those who don't know, who didn't watch a year ago, why don't you tell us a little bit about who you are, what you do, and your expertise in the field?
Sure. My name is Richard Hogue. I run a law firm in Southeast Michigan called Hogue Law. And unlike some people that you might see online or in social media in general, I'm not a litigator. I'm not the guy on Law and Order that goes in court and yells objection. I'm not Phoenix Wright. I'm a business lawyer that helps draft contracts, all those annoying terms of use and licenses you see at the front of your video games. Somebody like me is doing those. And so I talk on YouTube and other places about the business and law of, among other things, video games. And so that's what I do on YouTube primarily.
Um, how long have you been doing that now?
Virtual legality is a little bit more than 5 years old. And that's the primary vehicle through which I talk about these things. And then I have another show called Hangouts and Headlines, which is a little bit more recently, that started in 2022, that talks about how journalists and media covers various things. That one's not as limited to tech or pop culture or video games, because I'm always interested in how journalists operate, obviously. You all are just inherently interesting. And so we do that show. It's called Hangouts and Headlines because we also talk to the community. That's a fun one. And I do a couple of shows a week, and then I'm also on the Bitcast at Seasoned Gaming every Sunday morning, talking about video games and what I'm playing and trying to figure out when, if ever, Rebirth ends, that kind of thing. And so it's a good time all around. I'm online way too much, like most of us, and otherwise running a law firm, not like most of us.
Yeah. You are a very, very busy person. Here's a little insight into how I do journalism. For the most part, I play video games and then I talk about the video games that I have played, and that has been the crux of what I do. I think the FTC stuff when you and I were talking about that last, that was my first foray into really diving into legal documentation and diving into the details, so to speak, and asking experts to fill in the blanks about stuff I didn't understand. It was really rewarding, and I found it really, really fun to do that with y'all. There is another case actually today. You have a video coming out tomorrow, but
I do.
maybe you could give us the TLDR about what is going on with the US suing Apple for an illegal monopoly of some. What do gamers need to know about this situation?
I actually think gamers need to pay attention to this one a little bit more than they might otherwise think. The United States, through the Department of Justice and a number of states' attorneys general, are suing the Apple Corporation, the ones that make your iPhones, for making those iPhones. They're suing for a monopoly power being used against competition in the smartphone market. And I'll have a lot more to say about that when I cover it in virtual legality. One of the reasons I wanted to cover it in that way is because we're going to read through the lawsuit together. And there's a lot of interesting parts, there's a lot of creative parts. If you followed me when we covered Epic versus Apple, Epic Games and Tim Sweeney
Yeah.
versus Apple, it's a similar type of case to that one. I would argue it's a little bit stronger from the Department of Justice, but it's not in any way a slam dunk or a gimme. So I think it'll be an interesting episode. And I think a lot of people are going to have a lot of things to say about it because there are a lot of developers out there that are excited about the potential of cracking open the App Store and the iPhone ecosystem in general. But when you look at some of the theories that are put forth by the Department of Justice and previously by Epic Games, one of the questions is, where does that legal theory end, right? Because we in video gaming deal a lot with walled garden ecosystems. You've got the eShop on the Switch, you've got Xbox Store, you've got the PlayStation Network, completely controlled by the manufacturers of these consoles. And so if the Department of Justice is going to succeed on effectively an argument that Apple uses control of its own ecosystem to control the larger smartphone space, that's something that Microsoft and Sony and Nintendo are going to have to pay attention to.
Yeah, I mean, could this potentially break down the barriers on the Xbox store, for example? could you end up having a PlayStation app on the Xbox store that allows you access to PlayStation games? Like, is that what you're thinking could be like the longer tail of this whole thing?
Well, I think you always have to look at how precedents can be used in the future. And here you've got a major entity, the Department of Justice of the United States, telling folks that Apple is illegally operating its smartphone market because it's controlling access to its ecosystem. And there are some other aspects of that that don't apply so specifically to video game console hardware, but there are a lot that can apply pretty obviously. That would open the door for future Department of Justice action, future FTC action, future Epic or any other interested party action in those spheres. Now, I don't think Microsoft cares as much about that as some of the other more specifically walled garden console manufacturers. You see that with Microsoft backing up Epic in their case against Apple originally, but I still think it's very interesting. And when the Department of Justice enters into one of these things, you can't just laugh it off or otherwise say it's never going to work like you might with a private action, was the case with Epic.
Um, yeah, I mean, to me, well, to go back to the question, is that what you're imagining could happen? Is that the implication of the case? Is that why you think gamers need to pay attention? Because could it tear down the walls, so to speak?
I think there's a possibility that if it goes the wrong direction for Apple, and Apple is not the most sympathetic target, right? They are not a company that a lot of people are going to jump to the defense of in general. That if the case goes against Apple, that legal rulings could come out that have language that suggests that the same type of arguments could be used by someone to break down those walls. Yes, I do, but
Mm,
that's about 20 steps in advance. It's just a case worth watching for video game fans, definitely.
interesting. Well, I'll start paying attention to it. Uh, more than prepping 5 minutes before we call each other.
It just happened today. I don't
Yeah.
I don't blame anyone.
How will Epic, Meta, Microsoft, and X, how are they going to work together to stop, or what are they trying to accomplish in this? Because I saw they're all teaming up.
They're actually teaming up in a different but adjacent kind of concept against Apple. So at the same time that this lawsuit has been put forth, the European Union, through their Digital Markets Access Act, or I think it's just Digital Markets Act, has basically cracked open these ecosystems within their jurisdiction, Europe. And Apple has what Tim Sweeney of Epic called maliciously complied with those rules. As it turns out, when you have rules forced upon you by regulators, the companies aren't always so willing to just go by what they're being told. And so Apple complied by opening up things kind of and had some warning screens that certain folks like Epic and I think Spotify didn't like. And so there are a bunch of companies that are trying to get together to establish why the European Union should be investigating Apple for this compliance. And part of that story does lead into the Department of Justice deciding to move right now. But those are different things. This is the lawsuit is specifically the United States and various states in the union suing Apple. It's not those private actors.
That's really interesting. So it seems to me like Apple tried to be a little sneaky with how they obeyed the rules, so to speak. I don't know what, intro screen or whatever was introduced, but it's like, warning, don't buy anything here. It might be bad. We don't know. We can't
Yeah, they were
attain to the,
security type
yeah,
screens, right?
yeah,
We're not liable for anything you might touch over here. Just things
yeah,
that sound scary.
yeah.
And yeah, so reasonable minds can differ kind of territory. Was Apple being maliciously compliant? They certainly were not directly in the swimming lane of what the regulations wanted them to do, but does that make their compliance illegal? That's a question. That's why they want an investigation. And I don't know how that'll go because Europe is its own animal. I'm not a European lawyer. And certainly in the recent past, Europe has been more aggressive in regulating these kinds of things than the United States.
Hmm. So what's the best outcome for Epic, Meta, Microsoft, and X working together? Like what do they want to see happen?
They want to see that ecosystem cracked open and have access to their own storefronts primarily. That's what you see the most from Epic. They want to have an Epic Game Store equivalent on that mobile device so that you can go and get things directly from them and that they don't have to pay that 30% cut to Apple. That's the goal for them. And that's a similar goal for the Spotify's and subscription services of the world. They want to have a reduced amount that they have to pay to Apple for access to that ecosystem.
If they win, though, do they not realize they're opening Pandora's box?
Well, if they win, I think they think they're going to make a lot more money getting access to Apple than anybody might get access to them. And so I don't think that that's really the equation that they're running when they look at these things. I do worry that sometimes we say in law that bad facts make bad law. And if you've got somebody that everybody likes to hate on, like Apple right now, if you go on social media and you see people celebrating the DOJ lawsuit, that kind of thing, that you can come up with legal frameworks that maybe don't work out the best over a medium to long term. But I don't think that those particular private actors care so much about that potentiality, especially Microsoft, who basically is giving up some of its walled garden already and wants access to these big piles of audience.
Hmm. Yeah, Microsoft has been really interesting. I was actually going to ask you about that because, it's sort of a good jumping off point to the topic. I'll get back to the FTC in just a second, but is Xbox doing any of this in in response to the FTC's continued behind the scenes still attempting to meddle with the Xbox Activision merger? Like, are they releasing those 4 games on PlayStation and some of them on Nintendo in an effort to say, hey, look, we're good guys, we share all our games? Because I see that sentiment discussed online, like, oh, this is a big strategy because the FTC is still digging into their stuff. Is there any credence to that?
Well, it certainly doesn't hurt them, right? It certainly makes them look like they're going to release more of their games on different systems and that they're more of a publisher than a walled garden kind of hardware manufacturer. And so I don't think it's driving their decision making. I suspect what's driving their decision making is a lack of a bump in console sales or Game Pass subscriptions, and then looking at ways that they can monetize their assets differently. But in the background, you're always looking at things from different perspectives, and you would say this doesn't hurt us with all the regulatory stuff we've dealt with. And if we ever want to make another acquisitive move or something of that nature, we can point to this in the future and say, look, we are good guys. We haven't held all this back from everybody. We haven't hurt the video game industry ecosystem on its whole. And so you should let us do these various things. So while I don't think it's the driver, I certainly think people can look at it and say it doesn't hurt. And that's the kind of reasoning that can get things done in corporate boardrooms.
Very interesting. I also just added the subscribe button accidentally, but if you've watched this far, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, hit that bell if you like the stuff that we're talking about.
I like to think it's just an endorsement of my answer. And
Yeah.
so subscribe, absolutely. If you like that answer, wonderful.
We actually haven't heard a lot about I know stuff has been happening with the FTC, like they filed the appeal and that's just been sort of sitting. They said like, oh, look, Microsoft fired all these people. They lied. Can you give us an update on what's been going on with their continued attempt to I don't even know what they're trying to do at this point because the deal's kind of done. So there's sort of 2 parts to that question, but what are they trying to do? And what's the latest with everything that the FTC is attempting since the deal is closed?
So broad strokes, they're trying to get someone somewhere to tell you that the deal was illegal. And that would give them the authority to potentially unwind the transaction as it took place, right? So one of the ways that Microsoft got out of getting a preliminary injunction on this deal, which is something that the court does if they think that there's a possibility it might be illegal, is by saying, look, Your Honor, even if this goes through and you later find out that it's illegal, we can unwind this really easily. And so what the FTC says is they say that you can unwind it really easily, but they've already combined their companies in such a way that it required them to fire up almost 2,000 people. And we're now asking you to stop them from doing anything with the organizational structure because we're not going to be able to piece this back together when you find that it's illegal because we're right at the FTC, right? That's their position.
Mm-hmm.
And do I think that will succeed? No. Their best chance of winning was in that preliminary injunction phase. It is much harder now after it's done. And so they're mostly just continuing to follow up their initial efforts to declare this deal illegal, but I don't think they have a high likelihood of success.
And what about the appeal portion? Is there like when do you imagine we're going to hear about that? Because it's been several months at this point.
Right. Well, it's a process, and what we got in the Microsoft preliminary injunction stage when they brought it to federal court was a kind of short-circuiting of a longer process. So I don't anticipate that we'll hear much more about it, probably ever, in all honesty. But if we do hear something more definitive, it won't come for a number of extra months, I wouldn't think, from here in
So
March 2024.
so in 5 years, are we
Not
gonna?
5 years, but probably not this year necessarily.
Okay.
They're going through their own process, and if they lose that, then they could appeal to themselves. It's a whole thing. But I wouldn't anticipate that process ending in any time period where you'll be satisfied that the whole story is over and a bow has been tied.
Like, so what happens? Let's say the appeal go like let's go crazy for a little bit. Let's say this appeal goes through and the FTC is like, we were right all along. Now you have to separate. Activision has to be their own thing. Microsoft has to be their own thing. How, like, obviously everybody's gone and Kodak's out and a lot of the figureheads are out. All these layoffs of the traditional employees. What happens if the FTC miraculously succeeds in this?
Well, then they would have the right to unwind the deal. And again, that's assuming that they not just succeed on their own internal court process, but through a federal court's order. And then, yes, things have already happened, but the FTC would have the authority to kind of separate out the entities and leave Activision as it stands, as recently hollowed out in 2024, and say good luck to you. Right. And there are various other things that they could look to do, that they could look to have Microsoft do in terms of funding or finding interim management and things like that. But you're right to point it out. It would not be the same afterwards, period. It's why unwinding is harder than stopping to begin with, and why they sought that preliminary injunction.
Um, yeah, I mean that's just sort of crazy to me. It seems more damaging to go backwards at this point. I don't know. It just seems strange that the FTC continues to pursue it. Has there ever been a case in history where they've gone that far and then the FTC undoes it?
I believe they've unwound deals before, yes, and they've certainly sought to unwind deals other than this one in this current administration. They've looked at the WhatsApp deal, they've looked at the Instagram deal for Facebook, and looked to unwind those, and that's a decade on. So they've tried it. It's not necessarily the case that they will succeed. It's a hard hill to climb, but I'm sure in history, which is a broad period of time, and I
Yeah.
cannot claim to be the full expert on all history of the FTC, uh, that they have sought this. The way the laws are written allows for it, right? It allows for them to essentially not object to a deal when it happens, like the
Mm.
Instagram deal, and then pursue an unwinding years later. So it's not the greatest legal system in the world on this particular point.
But just to dive in there a little bit more, can you think of one that has unwound and then like what happened to the company when they unwound? Or has it not really? Is there nothing that comes to mind?
There's nothing that comes to mind. Certainly, the American justice system has forced breakups before, which is a similar kind of concept, right? When you've got a company exerting monopoly power and whatever antitrust regulator you're looking at wins that case, you've broken up the Bell companies. They created all of the different the regional telephone companies, and then they separate out into those different entities. And then, as we've seen, depending on how protective the governments of the various eras are, they kind of come back together and coalesce when economies of scale make sense. So breakups have happened, various other legal remedies have occurred. It's not a perfect system, even if you think that there's an antitrust case to be made. And the FTC is not proven that yet.
Okay. Well, thanks for going on that journey with me. I do appreciate it.
Lawyering, man.
Well,
I'm working to try to give as definitive answers as possible when my instinct is always to say, well, that's complex.
yeah, right. Uh, there's another company that I wanted to ask you about. It's this company, Sony, who also has been having some stories come out about how Bungie has been doing lately. Uh, the rumors and reports that we've heard, and well, there was this letter that came out that a popular streamer wrote. It wasn't really corroborated, but then there was the Rebecca Valentine IGN report about like what's going on internally. And I'm going to paraphrase off the top of my head and what I've heard about the whole situation. Long story short, Bungie did these layoffs, about 100 layoffs last year before Sony did their mass layoffs. It sounds like Sony is not particularly happy that Bungie chose to go that route. It seems like the layoffs were actually to protect upper management's parachutes, which they need to remain at the company until 2026 for, and Sony's not happy about that. Legally, can leadership do all this, do what they're doing at Sony, and just bounce out of there in 2026? Because it seems like they overvalued the company by 45% when they were selling it to Sony, because of the revenue misses are astronomical. Sony seems unhappy about the deal, and there's rumors being that the company was overvalued. And I'm just wondering if is Bungie starting to get into some murky legal territory where they could be setting themselves up for some trouble? Leadership?
Well, I would say number one, we can't know for certain without seeing the actual purchase agreement itself, because that's going to delineate what rights and responsibilities each party has to the other after the transaction takes place. But number two, the shorter form answer to the question is yes, they can absolutely get themselves in trouble, because anytime you're talking about millions of dollars and you've got another party on the other side of the table that has millions of dollars of their own to pay for lawyers and whatnot, you're going to run the risk of getting into trouble, because once it's worth it to pay those lawyers to try to go get that money back, a lot of companies will do that. Now, in this particular case, I don't know that Bungie has necessarily violated their purchase agreement or otherwise committed any kind of illegality here, because when the deal happened, I commented on it that it was unusual that PlayStation had given them all these independence rights. And I presumed, because of the way any deal would be negotiated, that essentially Bungie paid for those independence rights because Sony was willing to pay more money if they weren't going to be so independent. And so there's a lot that'll go on behind the scenes in terms of figuring out what it is Sony bought, what it is that Bungie bought with respect to the purchase price that they agreed to. And if Bungie is specifically kind of cannibalizing its company in order to keep individuals entitled to certain amounts of money, at some contractual level, you look at it and say, well, Sony, you're a sophisticated party. You know how to protect yourself in a contract from that kind of thing. You have earn out provisions, you have representations and warranties that you won't do this cannibalization. If you didn't put those into the contracts, it's not my job as judge of this court to protect you. And so maybe you're out of luck. If those are in the contract, then yeah, Bungie leadership can get in trouble. But it's essentially speculation from here, 30,000 feet up.
Yeah, that's true. Like we don't have knowledge of whatever the deal was, but I mean, everything that we've heard publicly, like it's on all these articles about what's been going on at Bungie, it does sound like the company is in complete turmoil, with a lot of bets being made on Marathon being a success. And somehow magically all the Destiny players are going to go over to Marathon, but you've made it a hero shooter. Like I'm very confused about what the strategy is here, from Bungie, a company that I have loved for years, like since I want to say Halo 3 was the first fan video I ever made. So whenever Halo 3 came out, that was like one of my first forays into the industry. So I'm completely baffled by the strategy here. Does any of it really make sense to you from the beginning? Because everybody says that Sony overpaid for Bungie. Many analysts have said, not all analysts, of course. So there's that facet of it, and then there's this facet of it where upper management's like feeling the pressure in a historically difficult year for the games industry, 2023, and it seems to be continuing into 2024. Um, what do you see as happening?
Well, I mean, I think Bungie historically has always been a difficult company to work with. And we can see that just from the way that their relationships have ended, right? I've been following Bungie a little bit longer than Halo 3. I played the original Marathon series. I played
Mm-hmm.
Myth and things on my computer, my Macintosh at the time. I think they were Macintosh exclusive back in the day, to bring Apple back into the conversation. But I think you saw them be purchased by Microsoft. You saw that relationship dissolve kind of not amicably. You saw them enter into a partnership with Activision and have that relationship dissolve not quite amicably. And now Sony purchasing them, even when it happened, I said, well, they have a history of not getting along so well with the households they build.
Mm-hmm.
This is something I'd be aware of if I were Sony. And I don't know whether they were and it was properly documented, or they weren't. The one thing you have happening at Sony at the same time as all this, of course, is that they've changed their C-suite, they've changed their executives, and they seem to be going in a slightly different direction from a business strategy perspective than they were when they purchased Bungie, seemingly for live service institutional knowledge more than the revenue stream from any particular game, uh, whether it's Marathon, whether it's Destiny, or anything else that might be in the weeds from them. So
Mhm.
I think what you've got at Bungie is that for whatever reason, the culture hasn't quite fit in the way that Sony had expected. They're not quite working properly as live service consultants, or Sony doesn't want them as live service consultants anymore. So their entire value proposition has shifted to the revenue stream created by Destiny, by Marathon, and by whatever other projects they have in the loop. And so they probably are scrambling a little bit. That's not that unusual, as I say. Companies are always run by people, human beings, all the way down. Human beings make mistakes, even if they're in the highest offices in the land, making the most money.
Mhm.
So I think what you're seeing is a fairly natural kind of one side switches strategies and the other side is not set up to handle that properly, and kind of the resulting ripple effect.
Hmm. Well, no, I appreciate your perspective on it because I've been sort of watching the whole situation unfold. Of course, last year the layoffs were awful, and uh, I worked on fire team chat over at IGN for years, so I've met a lot of those people who work there, and it's unfortunate to see the current status of the company, and hearing that internally it's like not super cheery atmosphere right now, given the current just industry climate. Um, Jumping off on that for just a second, the current industry climate is definitely one of turmoil. We have layoffs all over the place. There's fans that are worried about console hardware is going to go away. I realize that's been a fear for many generations. Where Peter Moore recently did an interview, said like in 2007 we were talking about it being the last console generation. What's your take on where we are at in 2024? Is a lot of this just a part of the, I don't know, in higher interest rates and inflation, and it just being a scary year, for lack of a better term, for everyone, kind of, or is something else going on? What's your perspective on all of this?
Well, I think it's a difficult economy, certainly for luxury goods, and I like to describe video games as one of the tip top luxury goods of the first world. But it's also that these companies did bulk up during the pandemic and look at a revenue stream that maybe didn't maintain that same kind of angle of ascent that it did during those pandemic years. So when you look at 2024, I've loved the games released in 2023 and 2024. I think it's basically one of the best times to actually be a video gamer.
Mm.
And it's unfortunate that that isn't being realized by the developers that make these games. But I do think you're looking at companies that had a kind of black swan event with the pandemic, dealt with it as best they could. I don't think that they were evil or deliberately over hiring in this era, but that can happen when you have these kind of big time events that you've never dealt with before. And now you're seeing some of that kind of realized on, unfortunately, the people that make your video games.
Mm. Yeah, I think you kind of hit the nail on the head on it there. It's just kind of like uh, there was a trajectory that was happening, definitely. And I want to say 2021, 2022, where it looked like it was just growing at an exponential rate. And fast forward to 2024, and players are going down. There's more games than ever before, all competing for your time. And it has to be a challenge for the industry right now that just 2 years ago thought, the sky was the limit. And now it's just kind of like, well, let's rein it back in, and hopefully we can hold on to where we were at, and we're probably back down to 2019 levels of player bases, because it kind of went pew, pew, if you look at the graphs that we see online. I don't have any questions for you beyond that, but it is great to catch up. It has been somewhat slow in terms of news and topics, but you always do a great job of covering the big ones, and I really, really appreciate your insight on the industry and just especially the legal stuff that I don't understand fully.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I find that stuff fascinating. Obviously, I love thinking about how these big stories happen, right? You have these giant corporate clashes and these giant entities doing things like suing emulation makers, and How does all that happen?
Yes.
How does it work? What makes the difference between one and the other? And a lot of people ask me questions about that so that they don't get in trouble. And I like to help where I can.
Yeah, that's actually a good final question for you. Is emulation done given that fact that Nintendo shut down that emulator manufacturer? It seems like they've kind of squashed out one of the big ones.
Yeah, I don't think that emulation on the whole is done, but certainly you have to be wary of emulating a current system in the market and participating in Discord chats and things, and not putting your best efforts at squashing down on piracy, right? So Nintendo, who I know a lot of folks out there think is essentially an enemy of all these kind of modern movements, whether it's emulation or Twitch participation or whatever it might be, is going to be more aggressive than other companies on some of these things. And you need to know that going in. But no, I don't think the end of Yuzu is the end of emulation. It just is going to make people think about it in a different fashion and maybe be quieter about it in certain ways.
Got it. Okay. Well, thank you for catching me up on all of the big legal related things that are happening in the video game world. What if there was one place you wanted people to look for your content? Where would you recommend? You do so much.
Oh yeah, definitely YouTube. YouTube.com/Hoglaw is the best place to find me. As I said, you can also hear me on the Bitcast on Sundays at 11 a.m. Eastern. I simulcast that to our channel as well, Hoglaw, so you can catch us there talking about video games, along with one of your colleagues, Destin Travis. Tie Guy Travis is over there on the Bitcast with me.
He's okay.
Always a good foil. There's even a versus sign for when he argues with me because he likes to argue. He really does. And otherwise, I'm on Twitter/X at Hoglaw. The only reason I don't send people there straight away is you're going to get a lot of comments on things like Michigan football or Dune that maybe you don't want in your timeline. I don't know. But if you are interested in those things, they're over there on Twitter.
All right. Well, hey, thank you so much for joining me. Thank you, everybody, for watching. A huge thank you to the members for supporting the channel. We're going to get out of here and we'll see you for the next one. Bye for now, everybody.